Hello, welcome to Mind Chat. I'm Philip Goff.
Hello, I'm Keith Frankincense. Welcome to Smell Chat, Mind Chat.
You got a funny name. You didn't tell me you can have a funny name. That's not fair. I've got my normal name and you've got a funny name. I'm supposed to be the funny one.
I've not only got a funny name, but I've not only got frankincense in my name, I have some frankincense here. And
as well. We need to you need to approve these things as the director of Mind Chat. You need to approve these.
I need to fill in a health and safety form. Probably I do actually. I'm going to light this, and so to create a nice olfactory atmosphere.
Oh my God!
I won't set myself alight. Here we go.
I'm a bit worried, to be honest.
It's okay. What could go wrong? We need to create. You see,
famous last words.
No, we need to create the right atmosphere. You see?
Very nice. How are you doing anyway, Keith? I feel like I haven't seen you for ages, actually.
It seems a long time. It seems a long time. The last one was Sean and Barry, wasn't it?
Yeah. How you been keeping well?
Not too bad. Still not fully back to full strength after the COVID, but I'm okay. And you've got the new volume out, the volume of your essays on Galileo's error from.
Oh, that's not out yet. You can pre-order it on Amazon. Now you mention it, is Consciousness Everywhere? Essays by scientists and philosophers on my book. But what am I doing now? Yeah, I've just finally finished my grading. Marking, as we Brits call it, so I'm pleased about that. So I'm just wrestling with a grant application now, trying to get some money to try and work out if the universe is conscious. So try and get that together. That's not worth
a few bob. I mean,
I think we just need to get it settled. You know what I mean?
Yeah, get it settled. Yeah, once and for all. Then get on with more practical things.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, I think we agree on more than you think. Anyway, we've got a very exciting guest today, Keith. Do you want to know who it is?
I can't wait to hear, even though I already know.
Look, you're supposed to pretend. We talked about this. We talked about this. Today. He's breaking the rules. Mind Chat has strict rules. So today we have Ann-Sophie Barwich. We were discussing English pronunciation of this German name before but Anne tells me, you think about a witch at a bar, is Barwich a legitimate English pronunciation? I'm rambling slightly now. Anne is a cognitive scientist, an empirical philosopher at Indiana University, Bloomington, and has done some fascinating and pioneering work in the philosophy and neuroscience of smell. Sound good? What do you think, Keith?
Absolutely. And is the author of a recent book, 2020, called Smellosophy. And I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about this book. I love it. And I think no one can read it without having their minds opened and changed. So I'm looking forward to talking about this.
Absolutely, me too. It was a good read. I really enjoyed reading that this week. So, shall I bring her in then?
Yes, let's bring Anne in.
Hello, Anne. Welcome to Mind Chat.
Hello.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and also the kind of comedy duo stand-up routine, which is just brilliant. I love the frankincense.
It's not Philip, comedy. It's not
Philip,
comedy.
what would you have changed the name to if you would have known that this was the thing?
I'm put on the spot now. I could have, if I'd had time to prepare, I could have come up with some comedy genius.
Goth mixture.
We need a tumbleweed going past there, don't we? No, next time, I'm going to catch you out. I'll have a funny name. But yeah, how are you doing anyway, Anne?
Good, very good. Much earlier here than in the UK, but I'm on my third coffee, so I'm ready to roll.
What time is it for you again?
It's 10 a.m. So it's actually not that early. But
that's not early. 10 a.m.
You know, we currently don't have term time, so you know, I do like to work at night sometimes.
Right, right. Fair enough. Fair enough.
You're a lark, I bet, aren't you, Philip? I bet you're a lark.
Well, have to be with bloody little kids wake you up at 6 a.m, jumping on your head. So yeah. But no late nights for me anymore, unless I want misery the next day. But brilliant. Thanks for coming on. Maybe we could start. You could just tell the audience, anyone who doesn't know about you, or even if they do know about you, a little bit about yourself, how you got into philosophy, what you're up to these days.
Good question. I actually got into both philosophy and science by accident. So one of the most reproducible reasons, so to speak. And philosophy, it just took over. I originally was interested in literature and writing and did philosophy because I had to take another major. Turns out that just took over my night and my daytime. And I just obsessed with the way of thinking about concepts. And at some point, I got more and more interested in philosophy of biology, because it's so tricky to define. Like, everything in biology is messy. It requires rethinking what we consider to be principles and categorizations. Smell was another accident because I was more interested in organisms. What does it mean to be an individual? These kind of things. And at some point I had a crisis of just intellectual crisis right at the start of a PhD. Don't recommend that. And I saw a talk about smells. Like, I have no idea how we smell and how it works. And turns out, well, that is the question, the open question. I got obsessed with it, and I was very lucky, actually, that I learned more and more about, not just about smell, but lots of the scientists. And one of them, actually, I want to do a shout out, who is responsible or was responsible for me going into science, because like, this is very interesting, and was very keen on philosophy. Have you thought of going experimental? So he really brought that thinking on. That would happen later. It's Gordon Shepherd, who was, and I say was because he died a couple of days ago, an absolute giant and a true mensch in neuroscience. And he was very supportive of early career researchers. He supported women way before it was basically cool and now more acceptable. And he wrote many things, such as the synaptic organization of the brain, the revolutionary 1950s in neuroscience. So he did a lot of interesting work, not just in olfaction, but neuroscience in general. And so I want to do a shout out of Gordon. It's definitely recommended to read anything and everything he ever written. He wrote neurogastronomy, for instance, basically how the brain creates flavor and why it matters. And he was a living giant of the field and a source of information.
I didn't realize that was only a couple of days ago, actually. Oh, sorry.
I think anyone who reads your book will get a sense of his importance in the field. He's quoted frequently in the book, and it's obvious that he was even to someone who's coming to it as a newcomer, that he was a major influence in this field. So that was a lovely tribute.
So, Professor Frankish, would you like to kick us off with some discussion of this?
Yes, Smellosophy. I as I said, I love the book, and just for people who are completely new to this, just to get an idea of where you're coming from. In the book, you quote Patricia Churchland. You say, to understand the mind means to understand the brain. I think a lot of people think we can understand the mind. We can understand a lot about the mind just by sitting in our armchairs and just reflecting on it. Because after all, we've all got minds. But this emphasis from Patricia there is on starting with the science of the brain. And you call your book Smellosophy, and I take it that's a hat tip to Patricia's book Neurophilosophy. This is applying the neurophilosophical perspective to smell. So, and in your own career, as you said, you've moved from being a philosopher of science to actually being a practicing scientist. You actually have your own lab, which is amazingly impressive to all the rest of us working in philosophy of mind. You know, yes, somebody's they've got a lab, a philosopher with a lab. Oh, you know, it's like, oh, I want a lab now. Anyway, sorry. So could you just begin by saying something about why you think that approach is so important? Why you think it's important to get down there into the detail of what's happening in the brain if we're to understand the mind. Why is that so important?
I love that question because it challenges us to think about what philosophy is and also the methods that philosophers can adopt. And when it comes to neurophilosophy, that just blew my mind. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Pat Churchland, but also Paul Churchland. And quite often in philosophical debate, you see people focusing on their particular positions rather than the methodological program they advanced, which is what I think is one of the most spectacular developments in modern philosophy. Namely, really to say, there have been utter revolutions since the 1950s in neuroscience. Our understanding of the brain really changed. And in parallel with that, also our understanding of many mental processes, such as memory, for instance, rather than having these kind of films or stable representations or images, we now have something that's being constantly overwritten, that's manipulable, that's a trace, that's changes the moment you recall something based on the context you recall something. And these insights also into the psychological dimensions of memory, its manipulability, its susceptibility to influence and emotions and all these things are deeply connected with the neuroscience behind that. So that it's changeable, that it's also to what extent you can manipulate certain things, you can represent certain things. And that for me is a deeply philosophical aspect because it challenges us to think about, well, why did we actually get from our introspective perspective this mental phenomenon also partly wrong? I mean, when you say, well, we all have minds, and the question is like, does that give us access to what we really experience? And I think partly yes and partly no. There are many things about which we can be deceived. This is where we come to smell soon enough, because that is one of the things that have been misrepresented for hundreds and hundreds of years and also misunderstood. Well, we all smell. I mean, both smelling things as well as smelling. So why did we get so many things wrong? And how can neuroscience be used, scientific insights, in order to challenge and change our understanding? And Patricia Churchland was one of the first ones, really, and the one who put it into a program to say, we can look and we should look at neuroscience in order to think about what are the mental categories by which we should understand the mind as a general phenomenon, as well as reflecting back on the brain, because so far a lot of neuroscience also sometimes happening by we just match a mental concept onto a neural correlate. That's also not the right way to do it. So philosophers are not handmaidens to science in the sense of, we're asking the questions and we do our little discourses, but rather given these new developments in science, we should reflect on the categories by which we study the mind, both in terms of the mental parts as well as the psychological dimensions. So for me, she mainly put forward a philosophical program, a methodological program, which to end actually with Paul Churchland see also wonderfully done in his The Engine of Reason, The Seed of the Soul. Wonderful book, perfect to teach undergraduates. He did that book, he published that book in the 1990s, just when fMRI was taking off, just about then. And he did a lot of foresighted aspects of how philosophy can ask questions in tandem with the science. He was there before connectionism became popular. He looked at many of the models to link philosophical concerns about perception, about consciousness, to both historical aspects, such as Turing, of course, as well as scientific developments. I mean, I think it's a good program, and neuroscience gives us a new form to do philosophy.
So, is this right then? That, and I think this is something that I've understood better from reading your work. That there's a tendency, I think, among philosophers and perhaps among psychologists to think, well, look, we sort of tell you what mental processes and mental states are. We just sort of think about them when we do some experiments with subjects and get an idea of their abilities, and then we just say to the neuroscientists, oh, just go over them, just find out what's doing this. This is what needs explaining. We've already identified it. You just go and tell us about the mechanisms that make it do it, as if we've sort of identified the program and we're just asking the neuroscientists to do the hardware. You're, I think, offering a very different perspective. You're saying, no, maybe you don't know what the phenomenon is. You think you do. You've got this idea of it, but no, we need to look at the detail of what's happening in the brain to understand what actually needs explaining in the first place. And it's only by tracing those very detailed causal processes that we really understand what we're trying to explain in the first place, what smell is, what memory is, and so on. Is that right? Is that the sort of change of perspective you're asking us to make?
We should have co-written that book, because I think that perfectly encapsulates it. So I precisely what you say, like, this is actually a positive role for philosophy, because of course there is the danger that when people go too much into science, and during my career when I went into science, at some point you do go native and you talk like a scientist and you think like a scientist, and it took me a couple of years to reclaim my practice as a philosopher as well, which is a challenging thing, because I mean, when you go into a lab and you do laboratory work, the question that now occupies a lot of my time is, what's the philosophy in the lab? Like, what's the particular philosophical contribution, in addition to, well, I conceptually think about science? And my current answer might change, who knows? But my current answer is, for instance, that the difference between science and philosophy is not an empirical one. Like, this is what we often expect. Like, oh yeah, a scientist just does experimental work and a philosopher then does this conceptual work. I think the difference is evidential. So we think about evidence and what's a support for something or a limit of something differently in science and philosophy. If you prepare a study and you want to show, hey, this is what's happening, or this is what I'm studying, and this is my hypothesis, you link it to studies and the existing body of knowledge in a different way than if you're doing a philosophical argument and a philosophical proposition for a possible model, for instance. And that is also reflected in publishing, but I think it's a different way of dealing with evidence, plausibility, and possibility, and to link an idea to existing ideas, or to kind of contrast it. So it's less an empirical but an evidential relation.
That's really interesting.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. It's a fascinating question. What exactly is philosophy? And I think people ask you all the time, don't they? Every time you say I'm a philosopher, people say, "What the hell is that?" I think that's a nice way of drawing the distinction. And I guess people also thinking, what have philosophers got to contribute to finding out about reality? People usually think it's just the job of science. Maybe philosophers make us feel a bit better about reality, but it's the job of scientists to find out about it. But that's a nice way of
not sure whether they make us feel better. I mean, if you think of Schopenhauer, etc., it's not really optimism.
Bringing us down. But so a big theme of the book is, as I'm understanding it, maybe that philosophers tend to focus a little bit too much on vision, and that this can maybe lead us into kind of rather narrow ways of thinking about the nature of perception. But then when we reflect upon the actual neuroscience of smell, it reveals that it's in many ways a radically different story to what we find in the case of vision. And so there's a complicated story, lots of different aspects to this, but could you maybe spell out some of the ways in which there are quite radical differences between vision and smell, and why this might be leading us astray?
Yeah, so I should maybe start with a disclaimer that I do like to sometimes contrast vision with smell, in a way that a friend of mine is a vision researcher, and he looked at me like, "You're simplifying the visual system a little bit." It's like, yes, I do. And you know why? If it's so much more complex in vision, imagine what smell is, because I'm also presenting you actually a simpler form of smell. So I'm not actually saying that vision is not complicated. It's one of the most fascinating systems around there. There's still a lot of open questions. I think the danger is by focusing on one system as the model system, which has been vision for both pragmatic scientific reasons as well as intellectual, philosophical, and historical ones, is that we're overemphasizing certain features of a system and generalize from them. And I think, for instance, that we also don't understand vision as well as we think we do sometimes. And for theories of perception built on vision, they often focus on features of the visual system, such as object representation, the stability of perception, the filtering out of noise, that might A, not apply to all the senses, and B, might not even apply to vision. So one of the fascinating things was when I read David Marr's Vision, which is a great book, and I think everybody should read it, both philosophers and scientists. He actually defines the computational problem of vision as stable objects. Like we're recognizing stable objects, and he refers to, of all people, Gibson. And this is basically what Gibson identified. And I thought, sure, this is often what we think vision is for, but how is this justified that this is the function and also not just simply a function, and it might not be the prominent one. A lot about vision is actually about motion, what happens at the periphery. It's not just focus. There's much more to what we use vision for, plus also to what extent how we identify the function of vision is ecologically defined. We're living in a stable environment. I mean, we have, like, if you look at our cities, our basic environment is quite stable. But if you think about nomads or people who live also, let's say, in the desert, you've got a completely different use of vision in order to orient yourself. And smell is a good model system, given that it seems to defy some of these representative features of the visual system, to rethink the senses, because smell doesn't seem to be as stable. It's harder to talk about objects in the same sense, at least, as we talk about visual objects. Certain things don't make sense, like, let's say, the directionality of a smell. I mean, it would sound odd, at least. And the lack of conceptual language for describing also our phenomenological experience in relation to science then as well, because you see also that kind of lack of conceptual richness, both in philosophy as well as science. That's a good way to restart actually discussion about the senses and to see what have we overlooked by focusing on certain kind of representative features.
Right. And one of the central questions in your book is, what is smell representing? Perhaps representation might not be quite the ideal word, but anyway, vision's representing surfaces and colors and shapes and angles and
stuff,
distances and stuff in the world around us. Which, now, what's smell representing? And you start with, well, you start with various suggestions. One is it's representing chemicals, different molecular structures in the air that are entering our nasal cavities, and so does smell represent the categories that the chemist would use to categorize these molecules? And you explain why it doesn't at all, because the way that molecules interact with the receptors is in the nose is very, very complicated, and it's something that there's been really a revolution in understanding that in the last 2 or 3 decades. Could you say a bit about that, because it's really key, I think, too. I suppose a lot of people still think that there are certain molecules that act like, I mean, the idea was there's like a key and a lock. The molecule is the key, and the receptor in the nose is the lock, and it opens it, and that's it. That's that chemical, whatever it is. It's not like that, is it? It's much.
It's actually much cooler. So I like this question, because it will also connect with some details further to Philip's earlier question about like, okay, so what's so different? Also on the actual scientific side, not just on the conceptual side, but so. We often describe smell, and you see it also in many of the scientific textbooks, of what we smell are chemicals in the environment, like airborne volatiles that hit the receptors in the nasal epithelium, and that somehow would presumably lead to a representational model of either the objects from which these odorants come from, so odorants is the term for the stimulus, or the kind of molecular clouds that do emanate from these objects. And this differentiation is an idea by Bill Lycan, who actually said, well, we can talk about different kinds of objects when we talk about the representational capacity of smell. The ordinary objects, basically from which these molecules come, the molecular clouds, and then the mental objects. And when it comes to what is actually being represented, I don't like the notion of representation per se. I think that Nicholas Shears, I don't know how, this is where my name issue comes in, but you all know about who we talk. Talks about is kind of minimal representation. And that is for me a much more apt description, because we don't necessarily in smell have this molecule represents this object, nor do we have necessarily a clear-cut understanding of molecular mixtures, like this mixture is necessarily that thing. You might think, wait a second, that sounds odd. Like I know coffee when I smell one. I know frankincense when I smell it. Well, yes and no. So with coffee, for instance, it's hundreds and hundreds of molecular of odorants in there. Within that, none of the individual molecules smells of coffee. So it's kind of like Aristotle said, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. In fact, you have odorants in there. This is one of my favorite examples. So some of the listeners might have already heard me talk about that. But 3% of coffee is indole. And indole is a molecule that literally smells of shit. So welcome to your daily habits. But you have the same also in jasmine. So there's a minimal percent in jasmine that also smells of shit. There's indole in it. You have Calvin Klein's Eternity, which is full of indole. So eternity is literally full of shit. I like the perfumer. This is a joke. Like when people say, "Are they olfactory jokes?" This is an olfactory joke made by a perfumer. I love it. So what this leads to is the fact that we can't just make a straightforward connection between the molecules and the representation or the kind of perceptual image. A lot of the reasons for that is not just mixtures, basically interacting at the epithelium, but also each molecule doesn't have one quality. Like with color, you see green, you see blue, you see yellow, but you don't see another color, let's say green and purple at the same time. But with smell, you can have it. Let's say you have certain molecules. There's a musk molecule where it smells of musk, but also fruity. So kind of like Walt Whitman said, I contain multitudes. Each stimulus has multiple qualitative features. And here, for instance, the big difference to the visual system comes in. Not just do you have multiple, and I really mean multiple features. Sometimes you can have 3, 4, 5 different qualitative qualities of a stimulus, but also you and I will really not smell this molecule necessarily as the same. So there are some perfumers, for instance, who would say, well, this is clearly musk, and another says, well, this is musk and fruity. Why is that? And this is why the biology comes in, why we need to understand this kind of seeming subjectivity in its causal roots, and why it's not subjectivity but variability. Because you and I, we don't have the same receptors expressed in our noses. So humans have about 400 olfactory receptors. Compare that with vision, we've got 3 + 1.
Don't worry, I just occasionally put up comments, don't worry.
Okay, because I can't multitask. Multitasking for me is an absolute lie. So if there was a question, I'm sorry, I will get to it later.
Maybe I'll look at the comments and bring some questions.
We can have the questions later.
Awesome, because I think there was something about cancelling out. It's like, okay, I need to, but
we'll keep them coming and we'll bring in questions at the end.
Keep them coming.
Sorry to distract you.
Back to the receptors, because this is where I get excited. So if I start to shout, I'm very sorry, but these are absolutely awesome. So these receptors, basically, we have the most genetically heterogeneous system when it comes to olfaction. So you and I do not express the same receptors. And you might wonder, okay, but why does that mean that you might, let's say molecule A, you smell musk, I smell muscat fruity? Because what happens at the receptor sheet is a combinatory coding. So you have basically one receptor can detect different parts of different molecules, and one molecule can be detected by different receptors via different parts. This is why you can smell so many different, shit tons of molecules. There's a calculation, I swear a bit, but there was a calculation a couple of years ago that humans can discriminate up to 1 trillion odors. Number has been debated a little bit, so the official number is really shit tons. And you wonder, how does that happen? Well, if you think about the combinatorial explosion, not just at the receptors in relation to molecules, but also the fact that each individual molecule has about 5,000 molecular parameters involved in its binding with the receptors. That's like mathematics of the brain. And this is why olfaction is already different from vision. You've got a high dimensional stimulus compared to vision, where you this is why I say, I know I'm simplifying color vision here, but you've got one key parameter versus 5,000, or at least 2,000 to 5,000. Depends on which ones of these chemical features are mainly functional or also involved in terms of when you've got a chemical environment of the molecule within a cloud. Anyway, so the thing is that you and I do not have the same receptors. So let's say we've got an odorant, a musk molecule, where it's detected by, say, a dozen of receptors. say you lack one or two of these receptors that not expressed, not lack. You don't have one or two of these receptors expressed involved in the binding of this odorant. So for you, it's musky, and for me, it's musky and fruity because I express these two receptors. So there's the genetic diversity of the olfactory system linked to perceptual variation. And you're like, well, you're making this up. No, there were actually a couple of studies recently showing to what extent the diversity of humans, like the genetic diversity, links to perceptual variations, also in the perception of odors. And that's, again, something where we have to really rethink about how we do science and how we also extrapolate philosophical insights from science. Because guess what? How do we learn about science? How do we do our models? With genetically homogeneous model organisms such as mice and fruit flies. So again, like it's a two-way street. It's not philosophy as the handmaiden of science or science as just delivering the evidence for philosophical theories, but it's an epistemic iteration. So these already as a couple of ideas of why the biology of smell is important for theorizing about perception, not just smell, but also to what extent it can explain actually age-old philosophical questions, such as, do you smell really the same thing when, it's roast by any other name, does still smell as sweet? Well, sweet is actually not a smell. Let's not go into these kind of things. But just to show to what extent we can rethink these subjectivity, objectivity things, deeply philosophical questions, in light of causal evidence or of how we start to investigate these things with science.
And it's even more complex than that, isn't it? Because it's not just that there are so many different molecules that we can detect, but they have different effects on the receptors in different combinations. In some, you say that if a certain molecule might trigger a particular receptor when it's on its own, but then if it's in the combination with certain other molecules, it might actually inhibit that receptor. So there's all sorts of cross-cutting effects between interactions between within mixtures. That you can't just add up the individual effects of the individual components in a mixture, and it's not like that at all. They interact.
Exactly, and that is one of my favorite studies. So these things I'm describing, for instance, they're all very recent. So the receptors were discovered only in 1991 by Linda Buck and Richard Axel, who got the Nobel Prize, both of them, in 2004. And lots of the most interesting advances have been done in the last 10 to 20 years. And the study you mentioned, or the idea you mentioned, that mixture perception is not additive. So you can't just add on the receptors from the individual odorants and you end up with a full pattern, is a study that was actually done in the lab of Stuart Firestein, where I actually spent 3 years, and from which this book emerged, because he let me not just observe the science and kind of participate in the lab, but also meet his colleagues. And the study was done during the time while I was in the lab. And they had this wonderful technology, because Stuart's former grad student, Lu Shu, she is married to Wenzi, and he was in the lab of Elizabeth. I can't believe I'm currently blanking on her name. This is embarrassing, but that happens. I'm getting old. Tenure me now. I should tell Jutta by my chair, like, tenure me now. I'm already starting to forget things. The name will come. Anyway, they have this fascinating new tool, scape microscopy, which allows you to really, really record the neural and muscular activity of small organisms such as fruit flies or larvae, or at least like huge intact tissue sections such as, like, say, epithelium of mice. So they recorded over 10,000 epithelial cells, like neurons, to spritz mixtures at them, because you could also zoom in to the single cellular level. And Stuart thought, like, that's ideal to check how we perceive mixtures. If you can see this population coding as well as the individual cells. I get to where that matters in a moment, but they did 2 mixtures of 3 odorant each. They consulted perfumer Christophe Loremiel, who's also in the book. He's awesome. Who basically told them, like, try these molecules, their perception is similar. Try these molecules, they're chemically dissimilar enough, etc. And they spritzed these odors at the epithelium of the mouse, and they found 2 things. And while I was in the lab, they found one thing where there was inhibition. So certain cells didn't respond to the mixture, but they responded to the individual odorants, or just basically binary mixtures. But as soon as a third one came in, they didn't respond. That was not entirely unexpected. What was shocking was the amount. 20 to 30% of cells stopped. That's a lot of things. What they also noticed, and this is where Stuart was like, I for a long time didn't know what this was about. They also had enhancement effects. Certain cells that didn't respond to individual odorants or the binary mixtures responded to all three together. Again, 20 to 30%. Like, this is a massive effect. This is like this one cell going like berserk. And he was like, I have no idea what that means. And I kid you not, 1.5 days before I had to submit the final version of the book, he wrote me an email. We have it. Here's the drafts. So my mother took a picture because I was in the kitchen, just like, I need to get this in. So this is actually how fast this science is developing. Like, this is really ongoing, and there are now studies coming out that really further push some of the ideas I proposed in the book, such as, well, what does it mean not to have a stable representation? Well, it turns out there was a study after the book, I think in 2021, by Schoenhofer and Fink from the Axel lab. They worked 6 years on that study, where they showed representational drift. And this will be also exciting for many philosophers thinking about representation object reference, so to speak. Representational drift has never been observed so far in a primary sensory cortex, only in higher level learning association centers. What that means is they trained mice on particular odors. So they had this behavioral study, and they also recorded which neurons in the piriform cortex, which is the largest part of the olfactory cortex, the primary sensory cortex and olfaction, responded to. And here comes the shocker. Within 28 to 31 days, the neurons responding to this particular odorants on which they were trained shifted completely. So after 1 month, none of the neurons first responding to it didn't respond the second time, but the behavior remained stable. Like, how cool is that? That is massive. And so the question is like, well, again, for a philosopher, very relevant. We clearly have behavioral stability. We clearly can identify odorants, but it's not pinned down to individual neurons or particular, this must be it, but more like, what are the dynamics? And this is where new advances in neuroscience and cognitive science, when it comes to dynamical systems, might give us a better idea of going away from this localization strategy and more in terms of dynamics. And that's why I really emphasize this processual aspect of perception rather than this object-based one, both when it comes to what happens in our mind as well as what happens in the brain.
So I think, I mean, what's great about the book is questioning these assumptions that are sort of taken for granted when philosophers think about perception, which is kind of what philosophy is all about, really, I suppose, isn't it? But just to pin that down a little bit more, and it connects to what you've just been saying, thinking about objectivity. So I guess philosophers might naively think, well, smell is just totally subjective, isn't it? Because one person smells one thing, another person smells something different. So it's not like color where you can get it right or wrong. I'm playing the naive philosopher now, by the way. I am a naive. I'm also playing one. So but in the book, you sort of it's not that you say you don't agree with that. You want to say smell is objective, but maybe rethinking how we think about perceptual objectivity. Can you say a bit more about how we can think of smell as objective, given these apparently subjective aspects of?
Yes. So one thing, for instance, what my pet peeve is, smell is subjective. No, it's not. Oh, my battery is going down. Let me quickly actually plug in perhaps the power cord before I'm completely gone. 1 second.
No worries. Keith, it's time for your banter. What were you gonna do? You were gonna do some performance when you got 20,000 Twitter followers. What was that? And did you ever do it?
The guy who comes on at the end of the Morecambe and Wise and says, "Now it's finally my chance to do my song," and he just starts, and then they cut the end. No, that's way too old an reference. Okay, I know. I'll do some Shakespeare. Okay, I've always wanted to do this. Okay.
No, we're back.
Okay.
Keith was just about to do some Shakespeare, but you've saved us from that. He's disappointed that he didn't make it as a Shakespearean actor.
We might still get to Shakespeare.
No, we won't.
There must be some great lines about smell in Shakespeare. I'm sure there must.
Oh, there's. I mean, the poetry is full of really cool things. So, before I go to the objectivity subjectivity thing, just one thing, for instance, if you look at poetry and really nice literary descriptions of smell, they are rich, and they show to what extent we have an impoverished modern conceptualization of smell. It wasn't always like that historically. So there were many more words we used for smell. There were many more expressions to connect our phenomenological experience with what we're basically sensing as smells and as the kinds of circumstances, emotions, and objects we associate with them. That being said, I don't have that in the book for the very simple reason is that I could have written so many books just about this one particular issue. And when people often go like, well, you didn't mention X or you didn't mention Y, there's often a reason. And one of the reasons, not the key reason always, but one of the reasons is when I submitted the first draft, it was 150,000 words. And my editor came back and said you submit 80,000. So Janice was like, can you pin it down? And then I've got reviewer comments, so I had to add things, etc. I deleted so much. 1/3 of the book was cut. Wow. So when people go like, why didn't you mention X? Well, there's a pragmatic reason for that, because nobody would have read for first-time author that kind of book. So I hope there's still things to do, and besides other people might come. It's a matter of time and finding the energy. But now back to objectivity, because I really like that question, and it's precisely the key aspect where the rethinking comes in, because it's not to say that vision is also objective in the sense that we all really perceive the same thing. We have a genetic stability across most of the population when it comes to the color receptors, but a lot of color deficiency effects, for instance, are genetic. So this is the common principle across sensory systems. To understand really what's in the mind, we have to look already at molecular cell cognition. How do the receptors interact with the stimulus, and how is the encoding of information in the receptors, for instance, determined by genetics? Like how diverse is the genetics, how many mutations, like how stable is the system, just simply genetically. We're starting very, very on the interface level. Smell is much more variable, and that is not subjective in the sense that you can't pin down this variation in perception to a cause. No, you can pin it down to a cause, and a very localizable cause in the case of genetics. So my favorite example is cilantro or coriander, where if you do a dinner party, you often have this one person who goes like, I don't like cilantro. These people are not weird, they're mutants. They actually have a mutation near one of the olfactory receptor genes. And this is one of my favorite examples, because it's a confirmation of what Daniel Dennett actually did in his Qualia paper, where he said, like, well, imagine, for instance, you've got he uses the example from a taste researcher who's just like, well, this particular substance is perceived as bitter, but there's some people with a genetic mutation who perceive it as tasteless. So what if we were to do a eugenics experiment? Well, don't do that, of course, but what if we were to do it? We just shift the population genetics from bitter to tasteless. What's the real taste, so to speak, of that particular tastant? Well, that's the wrong question to ask, of course. And similarly with smell. It's not about what's the smell of that molecule, but really based on the receptors. What do we commonly across a population perceive? And that's also why I think philosophers, for instance, do have an impact on science. Because you still see these structure, odor, causal links, and you still see these, but it's subjective because there's variation. It's like, no, you identified the wrong causal variable. We're not going from molecules to perception. The receptors define how we come from molecules to perception. You've got a complete different causal story that explains these variations, not as subjectivity. There are subjective effects, such as individual experience, but that's not the same as to say, oh, but we perceive things differently because there are also other causal factors involved. So it's much more about redefining objectivity in localizing and identifying the common causal factors and mechanisms that govern this variability, to differentiate this variability from true subjectivity, so to speak. And that's where vision and olfaction and many other senses, I think that's a general principle.
And what this is pointing towards then is this new understanding of the receptor mechanisms is also pointing us to a new understanding of the function of smell, of olfaction. I mean you talked about how the way that different odorants can interact and inhibit or stimulate the same receptor, and that you suggest that there's a very important function to that. It's that we don't get swamped with, because there are so many odorants in the air, and because we have so many receptors, we would just get swamped and there would be just this massive stimulation which we couldn't make sense of. So what's happening is these processes are kind of filtering out a lot of information and creating a distinctive sort of pattern that we can recognize, perhaps in a very context-dependent way. And so what smell is doing is not just mapping the world as it is, but looking for significant patterns in the world at this moment. Is that roughly the right idea?
Oh, yes. And there's so many things involved in that are actually quite cool. I mean, I saw there were a couple of farting squirrels, so I'll come to fart soon. I will.
For those listening on the audio version, there was just some comments put up about farting squirrels, so that's why, in case you're confused.
Oh, I didn't see those. Yes.
Sorry, I distracted Anne when Keith was asking his question by putting.
I will come to fart soon enough, because one of the reasons, and this is not a joke, why I love working on smell is you can do fart jokes with a very serious face. I mean, I kid you not, I had some job interviews and I did fart jokes, and the only people who laughed were actually the people at Bloomington. So I knew, like, I found my people. So it's like, yeah, everybody else was like, she just did a fart joke doing a job interview. Really? It's like, that's what you would get. Yes, I'm just being honest here.
The whole point.
That's the whole point of doing this. But coming to the receptor, so precisely what you say, one of the key things, and also the key things that's not just olfaction, but you see it also in touch, for instance, why olfaction is a more broader sense in its principles, is receptor habituation and adaptation. So you lose at some point, of course, when you're in a room right now, like you actually don't smell all the things that really are constantly smelling. You don't smell yourself all the time because you would go nuts. Imagine you could smell everything all the time, everywhere. You would go completely bonkers. You would ask to put me in a coma for now, because it would be overwhelming. And what the receptors do in order to just, because there's constantly information. I mean, you smell, your coffee smells everything, you habituate, meaning at some point the receptors stop firing. They're like, okay, this is like constant. We don't have to constantly fire. And unless something changes, so if somebody farts, for instance, whether it's a human, a squirrel, or in my case, a dog, this would change. This would alter the chemical composition of the environment to a significant extent that your brain goes, hey, something changed. That's why I think smell is much more about detecting changes rather than stable object representation. And it explains, again, a lot of the variability of perception. So when you've got a complex mixture, it starts to smell differently after a while, for several reasons. Like if you've got a perfume, of course, the molecules are basically released at different times depending on the molecular weight and other properties. So this is why perfumers have like top, heart, and I think bottom note. I'm currently blanking on the term again. But the other reason is that some of your receptors habituate quicker than others. And that's, of course, scientifically quite challenging if you do mixture perception for psychophysical studies, because, well, if basically your own subject is already changing within 5 minutes, habituating to a mixture, you can't do 12 minutes of experiments constantly smelling something, because you wouldn't get the same results. So again, this is where receptor biology helps us to understand what we're perceiving, and also to take also perception more seriously. It's like, I do seem to perceive something is changing, and you question sometimes yourself, but it should be the same thing because I see the same thing. No, you're really smelling something different. I mean, you're perceiving something different.
One thing I wanted to ask you about this that made me think of is, I wonder whether you think this kind of stuff sort of decisively rules out a certain view that some British philosophers are attracted to. Not, I should hasten to add, not the two you're talking to now, but certain British philosophers are attracted to naive realism.
Around Oxford, mainly, I think.
Around Oxford, yeah. Americans find this view I'm about to describe bananas, but some British people like it. So naive realism, just for viewers and listeners who don't know about this view, it's roughly the view that we're in direct contact with reality and perception, in the quite radical sense that there's no mental representation even mediating between us and the world. So when I'm looking at this beautiful Batman cup, the blue quality I'm encountering in my experience is the blueness of the cup. So my visual experience is literally world involving. There's no mental representation mediating between the two, and so I'm not even sure whether that story works out in the case of vision. But it seems to me, given all you've described about smell, it seems even more problematic in the case of smell, given this highly contextual nature of it and so on. Or yeah, what do you have any thoughts on this issue at all?
I want to start with, yes, bananas is a good word. But so it seems that vision might be an easier sense by which to model this kind of view. But there's luckily enough work also in philosophy of vision. One of the books I really like is Masvita Shirimuta's Outside Color, who has a relational, a variabilist account showing precisely what extent many of the color effects, for instance, really are relational and are not just simply a direct perception. But that being said, so there's two things which I think require some kind of nuance. And one thing is the question of direct perception, because one of the kind of naive or direct perceptual theorists was Gibson. And he had a different understanding from the British philosophers. So this is, for example, where I do think that Gibson had a point, but not in the way in which it's used by Oxford philosophers. Because he said, well, if we look at the sensory systems and we look at the senses as perceptual systems, there is clearly a way in which the information is reaching the receptors that is not clear, like literally several steps of computation, but it's already a structuring of the information in the world. And that I would agree with if you think about, let's say, that magnificent study by Ledwin and a couple of others in 1959 or 8, I think 9, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. Great paper showing to what extent the receptors already structure the information coming from the world. From that perspective, I would say there is a form of directness in terms of we need to really understand the information through the interface, so to speak. And then there is a kind of a directness, because it's not the same. The stimulus and the receptor features are not necessarily coextensive. And I can explain what I mean by that in a moment, of course. The other thing is, oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Sorry, I keep distracting you. For people on the audio podcast, I keep distracting Anne with bringing up comments. Maybe I'll save comments till.
I forget that we're not just in a now conversation, but that people might listen to it later. So I'll better stay focused. But the same with representation. So this is the part of the receptors and James Gibson, which I would support as a form of direct and naive, not in the full extent to which Gibson went for it. I'm much more like Ulrich Neisser, perceptual schema kind of person in modeling. But at least this is like the part I really like about his theorizing. And I think Gibson deserves a revival. Because quite often we refer to him as kind of the textbook Gibson, which is like a caricature of his ideas. I think he was a phenomenal thinker. And the other part is also the representational part. And there is a wonderful observation that was already done in the 1980s in Smell that challenges some of the aspects about representation when it comes to, well, there is clearly like a computation, several steps involved, so we don't have the direct perception. That being said, we need to rethink what we mean by representation, whether it's really the stimulus. And there was a researcher, Walter Freeman, who was the son of Freeman with a lobotomobile, and he did, way before it was cool, olfaction, 1980s, chaotic systems modeling. So what's now often kind of reframed or kind of in parallel with predictive coding. He had that already in the 1980s. He did DEG on rabbits. And he showed, for instance, to what extent a carrot, for instance, can have different neural attractor states. So the way in which neuroscientists would use representation more rather than representation in the philosophical sense. And he showed that the same stimulus can have different attractor states, so different neural representations in different behavioral context. And there is no computation in that sense, like adding on emotional, adding on behavioral context. It's right encoded. Like there is a directness between behavior perception and neural representation. So you had a carrot and it had this attractor state. You had a carrot and a particular trained behavior and had this attractor state. You had a carrot and specific, like a combinatorial with a combination of another stimulus. You had that attractor state. And that's again why we need to go away both from the stimulus as well as this fixed set of neural representation. Right. And that's why I don't like direct representation. But a friend of mine who's also in the book, Terry Akery, he recently, when I talked to him, said something which I think is quite meaningful. And I admit I didn't always stick to that view, but I do think I should adopt it more. Is namely, well, you can sometimes have positions that, from your way of seeing the world, seem to be ludicrous even. Or they're like, how can people believe that? Or how can people think of that? I mean, we let's not get into our differences, but you know what I mean. But the thing is, there's a truth even to some positions that you would say, I do think there's a wrong foundation for this thinking. That's being said, why does it seem to be intuitive in some respects, or what does it capture that could be also used for or within your view? So, or your approach to things. And I think this is a good way of approaching it. You sometimes hear that also, like one of my favorite philosophers of science and biology is Bill Wimsatt. And apparently he tells his students, even if you read a text that you find frustrating, you find stupid, etc., I don't want to hear it. He possibly says nicer, he's a nice guy, but tell me what you got out of it, so that this hour or these 2 hours of reading the text are not a waste of time. What's the thing that got out of it? His students are fantastic.
Yeah, no, I agree totally with that. I think that's right. Could I just try and sort of see if I can fit this into a bigger picture? So I take it what we're talking about direct realism. It's often couched in a sort of dualistic terms. There's sort of me, my mind, and then there's the world out there. And is my mind in here in touch with the world out there? And you know, what's the relation? So it's very sort of dualistic. And I think that sometimes carries over into physicalistic pictures, that there's the representations in here and there's the world out there, and how do these relate to those, and do they map them directly? And I think what the sort of picture that emerges from this careful sort of investigation that you describe here is that it's not like that at all, that there isn't any sort of sharp divide between us and the world. There's just a complex series of interactions occurring all along the chain, starting from the whatever object is giving off the odor, the odor plume, and then the interactions within the odor plume itself, the way that the atmosphere is moving, then the way that these things impinge on our nasal epithelium, that's the right word, isn't it? And then what are the complex interactions, which you've been talking about, immensely complex, with the receptors there, and then you trace that, of course, to the next stage. And not actually many steps are there into the cortex. Then it goes to the olfactory bulb and the little things there, what are they called? The
glomeruli. Yeah, so they're so cute.
Yeah,
they look like a string of pearls. Yeah.
And again, another lot of interactions happen there, which seem paradoxically to sort of cancel out a lot of the ones that had happened at the previous stage, paradoxically. And then there's a further stage where that's the signals from those are then taken up by the cortex, and all sorts of stuff, all sorts of interactions happen there. So there's no barrier, there's no sort of line where suddenly stuff gets represented or gets into the mind or whatever. It's just a lot of very increasingly complex and then of course all that then interacts with motor stuff and back onto the world again, and starts you sniffing or moving into following the odor plume or whatever. And so it's just a complex dynamical series of interactions that's happening here. Is that the sort of picture that all this is? I mean, that's very sketchy, but is pushing us in that sort of direction, that way of reconceptualizing the whole sensory process?
Oh, yes. And I want to give an answer in two directions to this. The first one is when we think about how the brain really works and why smell is different from vision and why we should rethink it. But then also, what does it mean for our general theories of cognition and perception?
Right.
And to what extent might that even lead us to different views of consciousness, etc.? So there is a broader picture behind that I'm working towards, but it would have been too much to include all in this book. But starting with the neural part, is you described really nicely the kind of what seems to be the complexity and shallowness of the olfactory pathway in one go. Namely, from a broad perspective, you've got these three key steps. You've got the receptors, you've got the olfactory bulb with the glomeruli, and then you've got the sensory cortex. And then, of course, further association with the orbitofrontal cortex, etc. But within each of these steps, you've got this intricate causal mayhem, which is super fascinating. And the olfactory bulb in particular is, this is basically where Gordon Shepherd was he was obsessed with the glomeruli, he was obsessed with the bulb. Like the circuitry is, if you just look at the interneuron details of how they interact, and they even discover new interneurons like morphological types. Like this is a gold mine of if you want to do rethink structure function relations in the brain. But the most important part is that it's non-topographic, meaning in vision you've got a really neat spatial discrete representation projection of the stimulus. In olfaction you don't. You sometimes hear people saying, well, there's, in the bulb at least, we've got a map, we've got a pattern responsible or kind of identifiable for each odorant. No, actually what you're having is a receptor activation pattern, and it's not stereotypic in the sense that it's genetically predetermined. And there's a whole chapter on that, on how that changed, because there's it's a developmentally induced map of receptor genetics.
That's a really fascinating chapter. The stuff about how the receptors find their location when you've done genetic manipulation on how they find which I still can't remember the word.
Glomeruli.
Which one they're going to go to, and how that's fascinating stuff. That I love that.
It's like a detective novel. When you talk to, I remember when I talked to Paul Feinstein, who is one of the guys who did the kind of genetic knockout experiments. And when I met him, and I was just like, oh my goodness, you're that guy. And he was just like, yes. I didn't know my study was that kind of exciting. It's like, it is. But the point is, like, even if you have a seemingly discrete activation, it might not mean what you think it means to evoke a common meme. But the next step is the olfactory cortex, of course, which has no spatial representation in that sense. It goes like the signal goes haywire. Like you've got these neurons innervating the glomeruli, projecting their axons to the piriform cortex, somewhere at the anterior part, somewhere at the posterior part. It's like coming from a neat English garden into the savannah. The organization seems entirely different, but you don't have, like, you can't predict where it's going to or how the brain actually knows, because you must imagine you've got in mice 1,000 receptor genes, in human 400 receptor genes, like gazillions of cells just going in all directions. So how does the brain know what it's smelling? I think that's an interesting question. Then, of course, on top of that, changing that activation pattern within a month. It's like, okay, I almost give up, almost. But one of the studies, again, from my former lab, by the Firestone lab, they were like, wait a second. He actually has a very good way of approaching scientific riddles. And he's like, well, how would it be otherwise? So you can have a lab with not so fancy techniques. I mean, this was a study with retrograde tracing, as technique known since the end of the 1970s. You don't have to have the most fundamentally new tools and sexy new stuff in order to really do good science today. You just need to ask the right question. How would it be otherwise? So rather than kind of doing an from the outside in, what if it's actually really a top-down projection? And they did identify discrete neural populations projecting back from the agrania insula, from the orbitofrontal cortex, further substantiating the emerging model of the piriform cortex as an association hub. It's much more about how our processes connected with each other, which seems to be very, very, very nicely linkable to how we perceive smells in context. Right. And that if somebody says something or you see something, certain qualitative features pop out. And my favorite example is wine tasting. where if you have a really nice glass of wine and you've got, let's say, a red wine, because I prefer red wine except for Riesling, but you've got a really nice red wine, and if you drink wine with somebody else, they sometimes point at features you haven't noticed before, but in the moment they say it, it's like from the subconscious to the conscious. It's there. You sometimes don't need to even smell it again. It's there. And I think this is like one of the things where philosophers can further investigate it. This is one of the things which I know I should have talked more about in the book, but I thought if I really want to carve out, and this is where we come to the general picture, this would be a different book. Because I think if we want to understand consciousness, we need to really go away from this traditional, these traditional dualisms you also mentioned before, because especially over the pandemic, already a bit before, but especially throughout the pandemic, and with my studies on smell, I became more and more fascinated and convinced by models of distributed and extended cognition, also with perception and emotion, meaning that I'm a neurocentric person in terms of I want to understand how the brain creates the mind. But I think in order to understand the brain, we need to really look at the interaction with the environment and how certain cognitive processes are trained and stabilized through habits, through our interaction with objects, with other people, etc. And that brings us to consciousness, because then the question is like, well, what if we actually can enhance or even reduce consciousness through our habits? We often think we just are conscious, or some people say like, well, there are certain kind of beings that are not conscious. I think there's also a thing of the same person can be more or less conscious, perhaps, given that, well, can you train your attention, your focus on certain things, whether it's through meditation or mindfulness, whether it's just through skillful interactions, or whether you at some point end up numbing the conscious minds down by just a repeated interactivity of the same thing in and out. So I think there's a broader picture when it comes to theories of cognition leading towards theories of consciousness, but that would be like an entire book of its own. I'm working towards that kind of stuff, but give me time. I want this day to be so much longer. I want more coffee. I want to be more, well, yeah.
I think there's a fascinating chapter. Well, all of the chapters are fascinating. There's a lovely chapter towards the end where you talk about how our acquired conceptual schemes and frameworks that we have, the different ones that wine tasters have and that perfumiers have and so on, how they shape it's almost as if I kind of got this picture that the olfactory system is sort of kind of offering hooks for us to and like say, look, there's a sort of way you could get this angle on the situation, and if we can give it a name and a concept, then we can sort of stabilize it. And that's one little tag that we've got on this particular aspect of the situation. And as you were saying, you may be tasting wine and you've not really got a tag for it, but your taste system, which of course is to a large extent your smell system, is offering you up a discrimination there, but you've got no way of getting hold of it. And then someone offers you a label, smoky, saying, you go, oh yes, smoky, and then you can tag it, and then it becomes stabilized. And so it's continually offering you like little footholds on this mountain of sensory data, and you can just peg them. So I'm not sure where this metaphor is going anywhere, but you can tag these little footholds and then remember them later.
That was really
the way
helpful.
that language and the conceptual schemes that wine tasting and so on offer in helping to structure and create a conscious world out of all these potential discriminations that the sensory system offers.
That was really revealing for me, actually. I think if I'm understanding you rightly, when the strange terms wine tasters come out with sometimes, like, tennis balls or whatever, but you're saying in a way it's, we tag on to something, and we might tag onto it in different ways, but that's what smell does. It allows us to sort of tag on to things like, the perfume of a partner, or you have the example of the smell of your grandma's garage or something. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation of this sensation it represents that chemical. It's more, a capacity to tag on to something. Although
that's why it's so potent. It's not because the smell of your grandmother's house sort of chemically it needs to be so rich. It's that it's so associatively rich, and it's become it's what enables you to tag all that associative richness through that particular olfactory stimulus.
Although all this talk of wine tasting, I'm inclined to think I am kind of is there a term for like short-sighted smell wise, actually, I think, and taste wise? Because you don't really, when someone can't hear as well as the average person or see as well as the average person, but you don't necessarily know. I just find I don't tend to smell things other people can smell, and I don't seem to enjoy food as much as other people. I mean, I eat, and it's okay and everything, but
also,
I don't.
Also, I gotta say, you are English.
Yeah, it could it could be even more than other English people, and
I'm very sorry to the English listeners, but
Northern English as well. We're from Northern England too. So.
But my former colleague Tim Crane, who's a philosopher and a keen wine taster, and he used to do these sessions, trying to teach us about wine, and I really tried actually, and I do think there's apparently isn't there a I think Barry Smith said to me there's a test you can do to see if you're a super taster or is there, I don't know if there's a term for like short-sighted.
There's definitely super smellers, and many people think they're bad at smelling. Like I hear this quite often. It's not always correlated with their actual perceptual capacities. So if you really do psychophysical tests, some of the people who say, "Oh, I'm so sensitive to smells," they're actually not that precise or good at smelling. And other people say, "I'm so bad at it," they actually are quite good. Oh yeah, Earl Grey. Good tea. I agree. But so. Yeah, I'm easily distracted, as you can see.
Sorry, I need to stop putting comments up because yes,
we had squirrels, we had farting squirrels. We've got Earl Grey.
Earl Grey.
I love the fact that you bring up Barry. So he got me into wine because I'll be honest. Before I started Smell, I thought like, well, there's two types of wine. There's red and there's white, and it kind of smells of wine. So what? For me, that changed with two experiences. One was meeting Barry. And he walked me through it. Like, how do you taste wine? It's a whole procedure. And this habitual interaction with your experience started to really enhance my abilities, but also to really extend the quality of conscious experience. So this is where I'm very thankful to Barry. And I mean, he's living the dream. He got at some point a couple of years ago, like a 5-year grant on aroma perception in wine. He got his hangover sponsored by the British government. I mean, that's all something we can aspire to. I mean, I wish I would have kind of put in a complimentary grant on cheese. But it shows just like how there's some really interesting thing also for philosophers. And I'm also happy to say that there's many upcoming and young and early career philosophers now doing Smell, which is really, really great. I gotta say. So yeah. Now I'm like, okay, I'm confused. What did I want to say?
What were we talking about? Tags and stuff. And,
yes.
Being smell blind, but I mean, if the whole perspective that I think that that Anne's presenting here is one where smell is it's an activity. It's a way. I've got to get this in. You talk about its way of measuring the world, rather than way of modeling or representing it. It's measuring. And what I particularly liked about that, I don't know if I'm over-interpreting here, is the idea measuring is an activity. It's something you do. It's an engagement with the world, and you can do it better or you can do it coarsely or very finely, but you need to practice and learn how to do it. And you need to learn. You've got this measuring apparatus that nature has given you, but you've got to train it and learn it and learn how to use it and what to do with its outputs, and then to integrate those outputs with all kinds of other activities. And so maybe what Philip's just talking about is just untrained. I mean, nobody's naturally, you don't have people who are, say, golf blind because they haven't learned to play golf. It's just.
But are there not some people who are naturally?
Well,
I appreciate we oversimplify, but sorry.
No, but there are people who smell better, and some people have less discriminatory abilities. So that is, it's just that sometimes your own judgment of your perception might not be the case. Plus, even if you're not that good, you can train it and you can enhance it. And both in the terms of psychological mechanisms of paying attention, focusing, knowing what you're looking for. I mean, that's similar to many other senses, of course, where through guided perception. You can enhance your discriminatory abilities. You get the tags to go a step further, as well as also your receptors. So they are shaped by experience and how you train them. And so this is, again, like, biology is wonderful because it's not disconnected from how you use your own system, so to speak. And you can enhance your biology as well as your psychological discriminatory abilities. But when it comes to, for instance, these kind of tags and the measurement aspect, I mean, this is why I do often stress we need to integrate philosophy of mind and associated debates more with philosophy of science and associated debates, because the measurement aspect, especially the aspect that you're constantly iteratively refine your categories, is known in measurement, philosophy of measurement. My favorite philosopher here is Hazok Chang, who wrote this book, Inventing Temperature. It's a fantastic book where he looked actually at a very seemingly simple question. It always starts with a seemingly simple question, namely, how did we actually start to measure temperature? Because we couldn't be sure that this is a real thing. Like, it's not like length where you put a ruler on something and you make some lines. But how do you know that temperature actually has a nomological relation, that there's a regularity? You arbitrarily define certain points and you devise instruments such as thermometer. But what if you actually have a thermometer with different liquids in there? Do they measure the same thing differently? Do they measure different things? Like, what's happening here? So you end up with this circularity. And he's like, well, the scientists at some point clearly solved this circularity. So what happened here? He's like, well, it was pragmatic. There was no conceptual way out of this vicious circle, but rather it was an epistemic iteration. It was constantly refined. And I think in a similar way, we can understand the mind as well. Yes, Hazok. Yes, there was a comment celebrating Hazok, and he honestly, I can only recommend reading him. And it's another example, Hazok, for instance, to what extent philosophers do have an impact on science. I throw Hazok metaphorically often at my graduate students here, and some of them have changed. One of them actually has changed their PhD outlook given after reading Hazok.
If people might be interested, one of our early Mind Chat episodes of Matthias Michel, who's also very empirically engaged philosopher, and we were discussing that very issue about how we calibrated temperature in relation to consciousness. So he thinks we're kind of at that stage with consciousness now, and we need to sort of solve the calibration problem. But I wanted to ask you, we've talked a lot about your book, which is fantastic. But I wanted to ask you about one of your other papers, actually, that I enjoyed recently. Reading recently, not readingly, where you defend quote unquote ruthless reductionism. And so this, when Mind Chat viewers or listeners think about reductionism, they might think about the hard problem, which we may get onto a little bit, or these kind of debates over whether there are certain particular phenomena like consciousness or free will or value or something that some people think resist reductive explanation. But in this paper, that's not the kind of anti-reductionist you have in your sights here. You more thinking of someone like John Dupre or perhaps my colleague Nancy Cartwright, and these people are not motivated by the idea that there's some particular phenomena that resist reduction, but more just the idea that the whole reductive enterprise of is sort of misguided in some sense. So I think I would just think it'd be interesting maybe if you could explain that sort of John Dupre-esque anti-reductionism and how you've come to reject it on empirical grounds.
I should maybe make a disclaimer first, because I mean, John Dupre was my PhD supervisor, so I'm kind of his black sheep, so to speak, because he's the hardcore anti-reductionist, and I wrote a paper on like reductionism, ruthless reductionism, which is a term introduced by another John Bickel, who's been at it also for a while together with the Churchlands. And I came to realize one thing. So I'm currently actually writing on another paper because I see what John is after. But I think there's, again, a need to rethink our categories. And when philosophers of science, such as, for instance, Nancy Cartwright or John Dupree, talk about reductionism, and you look at their writings, they have a very particular view of reductionism in mind. The kind of Putnam, Oppenheim view of reduction, where you've got an ontological hierarchy of levels and elements. So you have, let's say, you've got the atoms, you've got the molecules, you've got the genes, you've got the neurons, the cells and neurons, and so on and so on. And you've got this hierarchy. And John has been always saying, well, you know, if you look actually at causal explanations in biology, first of all, you see a lot of overlap in how we model these levels. They're not so clear cut. Second of all, if we try to categorize certain things, there is no essence to what makes these things, but there are certain features that are more useful in that categorization, and then there's some features of that thing in another, and they're equally valid because they're task and context dependent. So that's also the view of Nancy Cartwright, of course. I agree with the modeling emphasis, and I agree like this essentialist view is misguided. But I think that reductionism and essentialism is not the same, because John's view of reductionism is that you've got causal essences that are intrinsic and independent of a system and of context. Now, if we look, for instance, at some clearly reductive sciences such as biochemistry, we see something that fits both John's emphasis on pluralism, as well as his recent advances in process ontology, as well as a ruthlessly reductive account. So I'm currently working on a paper showing how biochemistry is actually a good example to what extent these seemingly incompatible views can be reconciled. And what I started out, it was a consequence of the paper you mentioned on ruthless reductionism. Because in order to understand what makes a certain physical-chemical structure causally relevant for a process is to view it within a mechanism, within a context. And that is not relative. And if you look at one of my favorite examples is the history of biochemistry. First half of the 20th century, especially Frederick Gowan and Hopkins, who got the Nobel Prize in 1929 for the co-discovery of vitamins. And he founded the Cambridge School of Biochemistry. And he labeled it very explicitly dynamic biochemistry. And then you look at how they actually define physical-chemical structures. And he was against organicism, he was against vitalism. He's saying we can really pin down organic life processes on physical-chemical structures, but that doesn't mean we reduce it to chemistry, but biochemists think differently than chemists. We have different methods, and also we think about these structures and substances differently. So you can have chemical elements that in isolation, a chemist would model them, for instance, okay, they're stable structures, they're solid within a particular chemical milieu, and chemists do speak of milieu within a context and environment. They have different properties. There's nothing intrinsic in that sense. It is their physical-chemical property, but it's not that what makes them as such based on an essence. So it's against the essentialism of Brian Ellis. But it is a way of really reducing it to physical structures. There's no add-on or something to be explained, because quite often we then throw around, oh, there's some emergent properties. And I never know what that means. And you read something about interrelated, correlated, entrenched, intertwined. I don't know what that means at some point. I mean, it just becomes its own. And it's not to say that this is always the best explanation, but quite often it leads us, again, like with smell, to a different understanding. If we take, for instance, the structures more seriously, we get a different understanding. So the mixture perception that Keith was mentioning earlier, like the whole is more than the sum of its parts, quite often was assumed, oh, clearly there must be some add-on computational process higher up. And then you say, well, what if we actually just rethink the way the receptors work? We can reduce, we can eliminate certain levels of additional modeling that are an artifact of how we conceptualize the system. If we get new tools that allow us, for instance, for studying population coding in the receptors, we might get a much more reduced and flattened single bound, would be John Bickle's term, picture. And this is where I'm kind of both, like, it's not for me a battle of the Johns, it's more reconciling them. I had a picture like the Battle of the Johns, where I had John Bickle and John Dupree in a conference, and John Bickle was sitting in front of me. He found it funny.
I had one of my first graduate philosophy experiences. Actually, we were reading one of John Dupray's books. I can't remember which one now. And he came to. We had a reading group on it. This is when I was a MA student, and then he came to the final session. And I was kind of saying, oh, no, we have to work out whether everything supervenes on the physical or not. That's the crucial question. Why are you ignoring that? And then he said kind of, well, what's supervenience? And I couldn't remember all the sort of technical definitions. So I went to Kripke's metaphor of, what God has to do. Kripke says, the question is, what does God have to do to create the world? Does he just create the physical, or does he have to add consciousness or whatever? And John Dupay said, well, I don't believe in God. And I didn't know what to do after that. So but it's not like you, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's not like you've got some philosophical reasons to think, everything's ultimately reducible to physics, or we have to tell some reductive. It's just that it can be useful in these particular contexts to maintain that reductive style of explanation. Is that the thought? Or
it's both a pragmatic account. So I noticed how much really reductionism helped me much better with designing my own experiments. So there's a clear pragmatic reason, but there also is a conceptual reason. Because if anything, we all know how easily we can be deceived by our own intuitions. And reductionism is a good way to challenge these intuitions if we just say, like, well, how could it be reduced? That doesn't mean you necessarily really say, like, oh, we can explain social interaction through the quantum level necessarily. If you could, and this is John Bickle's view, if you could find a way to intervene on the quantum level to really have an effect on social interaction, that would be actually quite interesting. So he has also kind of an operationalized account of manipulability by which he tries to link these levels. But again, what's missing here is what's important if we want to combine these different explanations is a better understanding of levels. Because if we look back at John Dupray's anti-reductionism, it's all about essences and levels. This is not the same as reductionism. And that's why I think, again, a philosopher can carve out these different positions. And I got some pushback from anti-reductionists saying, but what you're saying is not reductionist. And I'm like, well, that's just because you're like a little straw man. Like, I want Putnam to be my opponent, but I don't care what if you really want all these levels. I mean, either you want to understand what's going on, or you want to just have this philosophical straw man. But I'm on I think the former is more important.
Yeah. My own way about emergence is that there's a certain way of using the term that's pretty innocuous, but certainly the sort of strong emergence that some people posit. It's an explanatory. It's giving up on explanation. It's saying, look, there's some sort of regularity here which we can describe, and that's all we can say about it. And we just describe it at this level, and maybe there's no point in investigating the mechanisms involved in it because it just stands there on its own, and that's it. And well, but that just blocks the sort of reconceptualization that you've shown us how we can get by looking at the mechanisms involved and show that maybe it's not quite like that. Maybe that's how it seemed to you, looking at it from either a common sense point of view or from a point of view of some bunch of experiments you've done in psychology or whatever. But when you look at the actual, what's actually going on at a cellular level or lower level, you find it's not quite like that. And, you latch onto a different sort of regularity at the quote higher level. Let these sort of higher level patterns, I don't like talking of levels at all, but let them emerge from our understanding of what's going on at the base level. Otherwise, we're just going to get inquiries are going to get unnecessarily. We're going to not pursue some inquiries and focus on others that may not be profitable at all. So, is that similar to your motivation for this?
Very, very similar, and that of course doesn't exclude higher level descriptions of phenomena. So this is what's often like, well, don't we need high level descriptions for certain things? I mean, you can't just work yourself from let's say an understanding of micromolecular relations up to more complex. Absolutely fine. But that doesn't mean that they're not connected, and we shouldn't also reason from the bottom up. And exactly. I kind of see it more as a dialectical relation, because we, for a long, long time, have seen in philosophy of mind, philosophy of science as well, more these kind of push towards, well, pluralism, towards emergence, towards the complexity, contextuality, interrelation, and the rejection of stability, of essences, of reductionism, different aspects. And I think it's good to, given that these criticisms about pluralism, anti-reduction, etc., are actually very valid, what does it mean now going back? I do think there's the need for some kind of dialectical approach. And in the case of reductionism, I currently think it's very fruitful.
Yeah. Because otherwise we're going to miss explanatory connections. If we just go, it's pluralistic, there's that domain and there's this domain and that's it, and let them just carry on. So we're just not going to look for interactions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there might be some methodological agreement here. I think I do feel it's important to work out which things can be reductively explained, and I think it's pretty significant if something, in my view, we might disagree exactly on this, how I'm putting this, but in my view, if something can't be reductively explained, then it means it's in some sense a fundamental or feature of reality, and so that's pretty significant.
Well, come on, this is the elephant in the room, isn't it? Let's acknowledge
I wonder, because I think some people are like, when do they come to consciousness?
Let's do it. So look, in the book, you tell this wonderful story. You start with molecules, and you take us through the receptors and the interactions there, and the olfactory bulb, and so on, and the piriform cortex, and all this, and then the linguistic categorizations, and so on. And it takes all this in great detail. But I can imagine somebody, not me certainly, reading that book and saying, "Yeah, okay. So there's all this stuff about what's happening in smell, but where's the actual explanation for the feel of the smell, the smell qualia, the actual conscious experience of smell? How does that relate to all of these detailed processes at the cellular and neural processes? How does that just emerge from it somehow, or what's going on?" And they might say, this hypothetical person who I don't agree with might say, "Look, you've missed out the heart of the matter." I'll say something more about why I think that's a bad objection. But what do you say to it, first of all? What would you say to this person who says, "You haven't told me about the smell qualia"?
Several things. The first thing, I actually mentioned qualia in terms of Dennett. So for instance, when it comes to genetic variability and heterogeneity linked to perceptual variation, so the perceptual experience of an odorant will differ. So your qualia, if you want to use that term, will be different than mine. Why I don't think that term is helpful is not in the sense that I reject the fact that we do have some form of experience, of course, but more in terms of the reification that is behind that qualia debate. That's what I really refuse to reject, this atomization, this reification that seems to kind of underlie some of these arguments. And what I always find puzzling is the fact that one has to almost describe it as this existing isolated thing while I talk about biochemistry. It's like, what do you think is actually happening here? It's biochemistry. And this is one of the most fascinating things when I see people who do psychedelics, for instance. And there's a really cool group right now going more into the philosophy of psychedelics. And some people are panpsychists, for instance, and go like, well, you can't, link, like, you're taking biochemical substances to alter your consciousness. Why do you think I have to justify that the biochemical procedures I'm doing have kind of a qualitative effect in your mind? I mean, honestly, if I were to start anew, I would do biochemistry and psychedelics, because I think it will take us it will open up a lot of questions. I mean, that's what I'm mainly interested in about how shall we understand qualitative experience. And not in the way that necessarily everything is conscious, but why do we experience certain things? If let's say you take certain psychedelic substances, there's a dissolving of perceptual structures we have in normal or in kind of habitual perception. And I had one experience where I thought, oh, this is super interesting, where I didn't have psychedelic substances, but I had a psychedelic experience having a fever. It was one of the worst fevers I had. And I was lying in bed and the room was dissolving. It was fascinating. So the stability of perception, the window was changing shape. It was like the descriptions you hear from psychedelic substances.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean necessarily that, oh, this just shows that everything is kind of intertwined necessarily, but more to what extent, what is happening at the biochemical level, that the stability of perception is dissolved. This is where people from different philosophical walks of life, whether you've got basically a hardcore reductionist, whether you've got a panpsychist, whether you've got somebody who goes distributed cognition, whether you've got a neuroscientist, a biochemist, somebody who goes, I want to do Spinoza or whatever, find a mutual interaction. And we might disagree, and we will disagree on what it means, but we should rather help ourselves to refine the questions of how can we go from here. This is an interesting phenomena. So I think it's linked to consciousness in the way that for me it is biochemical processes. And I point towards certain aspects of consciousness, such as the reference to genetic receptor variability, or linked to qualitative differences in perception, as well as the aspect that you can extend the content of qualitative experience through training, and that it's not a given. And I think this is one of the more exciting things of the book. You can actually really enhance consciousness.
I mean, my answer to anyone who's, I mean, I must let Philip come in here, but my answer to anyone who made that objection to your book is that you're talking about consciousness on every page of the book, effectively. And you often hear people say, well, look, no account of what's happening in the brain will shed any light on consciousness itself, in this first personal sense. Well, I don't think so. I would challenge such a person to read your book attentively and tell me that you haven't shed any light on it, because I think you have. I think you've, I mean, absolutely, we have this vocabulary for talking about consciousness in the first personal terms, and we talk about the fields of things and what it's like, and we have all this rich vocabulary, and it's doing something. And what I think it's doing is gesturing in a rather inchoate way at the stuff you're talking about. And what's fascinating is that you can see why we're inclined to use those descriptions. You wonder, oh yes, that's why the smell of my grandma's house has that powerful emotive effect, because it's tagging a rich bunch of associations. And that's why when somebody mentioned that the smokiness of the wine, it leapt out at me. And you can see what we're talking about is what you're describing, and the mutual interaction between the language and the biochemical processes is illuminating. And so if somebody says you're avoiding the hard problem, I don't think you are. I think you're actually addressing it head on and showing us the way to see through it. So, but that's my little bit of a rant. I must let Philip come in as well.
Well, Anne might want to respond to that.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Very briefly, because I'm curious what you think and what you'll say. But precise about why I didn't use the language of philosophical debates about consciousness. That is intentional, because I struggle with that language. I don't find it helpful to address an audience that's not in that debate. And the book is explicitly tailored to, or written for, everybody who's interested in smell. Not necessarily people who are just focused on consciousness. And it's tailored for, it addresses people who are scientists, who are philosophers, all walks of life, perfumers, etc. And the other reason is also that the book is much more about combining what we currently know as well as the open questions to point at the avenues. There is a personal view as well, in terms of how I think this integrates, but this is where I think it's much more also to provide a basis. We can start from here. The questions are starting from here, rather than this is the answer.
I think it's absolutely, fine that there's only so much you can do in one book anyway, and what you do that beautifully. But it'd be great to write that book for the consciousness audience, for the people who the philosophers who are interested in consciousness, and because I think there's so much. I was going to use the word ammunition, but that's perhaps too aggressive. There's so much material there that can be used productively in that debate. There's so much potential, I think, in the work that you describe. So I'd love to see that potential. Oh, I'm sort of getting taken away by metaphors here. It's like I was going to say mined, but you can't mind. Like there's a seam of something that can be mined and used in that debate, and I would love to see you do it, because it's got the potential to do that thing we've talked about, though, that bottom-up reconceptualization. in that
working
field.
working on it slowly but regularly. But the academic spiel of like, I need more time. Yes, but
it would be a really important development, I think. Anyway, I better let Philip come in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. The way Keith was describing my position, I think, doesn't quite capture. I mean, I wouldn't say that Anne wasn't talking about consciousness in the book. She's talking about, experience and feelings and sensations. I mean, that is consciousness. And
I agree with that. That's consciousness in my sense, Philip.
No, but she didn't. I don't think I remember her pinning down exactly what sense of consciousness. She just used when using ordinary terms like feelings and experiences. I don't, I think
we're happy that there's a neutral sense then.
Well, anyway, you've had your turn, Keith.
Processes.
Anyway, yeah, and I certainly didn't disagree with anything in the book at all. I mean, I guess I'm not like the psychedelic people you refer to who think consciousness can sort of be autonomous from biochemistry or something. I mean, that might apply sort of substance dualist view or something. So yeah, I mean, obviously, from my view, yeah, there's a perfect correlation between the kind of biochemistry facts and the consciousness facts. Maybe I could put it this way, that I suppose it seems to me that what we know empirically does not logically entail that there's any feelings or experiences. And one way to kind of press that, which I think is very intuitive to non-philosophers, obviously there's a huge debate here, but just kind of gesturing at an argument, is thinking about the problem of other minds. I think it's intuitive to many people that what you learn empirically can never allow you to know for certain whether someone has feelings or experiences at all. And it's particularly pertinent with non-human animals, where fish, what we learn the empirical facts, it never seems to totally pin down whether or not the fish is a complicated mechanism or actually has some kind of inner life. But even when it comes to human beings, what we know empirically doesn't seem to totally settle the question of whether they're conscious or not. In the sense that
the process that Anne was talking about were experiences.
Wait. In the sense of logical entailment, I would say. Nothing we know empirically logically entails that anything about feelings or experiences, and that seems to me to show that what we mean when we talk about experience and feelings is logically distinct from things to do with behavior or behavioral functioning. Now, obviously, there's a very that's not inconsistent with saying, of course, there's a very close, perfect correlation between the biochemical facts and the facts about experience. And so that's the philosophical challenge. How do you explain that? You could try for a materialist identity, or you could try for a panpsychist view, or you could have some David Chalmers naturalistic dualist view. And all of these accounts, I think, would totally respect all the science that's discussed in Anne's book. But anyway, so what I suppose I'd just like to ask Anne, I suppose, what do you think about that very, very, very gestury argument that it's starting with the problem of the minds. It seems that nothing we know empirically allows us to know for certain whether or not someone has feelings and experiences, and that seems to reveal that there's at least a logical distinction between the empirical facts and the facts about conscious experience. What do you think about that?
I think that will bring us back to the distinction between philosophy and science not being a distinction based on empirical methods, but on how we conceive of evidence and relations. Because you say, well, the empirical facts do not logically entail that this has to be the case. Science will say, obviously, yes, because you can have the same empirical data leading towards different theoretical models or different theoretical models accounting for the same empirical data. I mean, if we think about the problem of underdetermination and these kind of things, there's kind of a weird echo. I don't know whether you can hear it.
Some people said earlier in the comments there was you were echoing for a little bit, Anne. Are you hearing? I can't hear an echo, but
I just heard an echo, so
on
I'm
yourself?
very sorry about that. Yeah.
Some people said earlier there was an echo for you, Anne, but then they said it had gone away. But I don't know.
Okay,
If
let me try
people
again.
could let us know in the comments if you're hearing an echo.
Okay. Otherwise, I can just ignore my voice. Okay.
We'll just wait and see if it pops up in the comments if you don't mind. It's so distracting, isn't it? When you I've had that situation in phone interviews often when you can hear an echo and it's like, oh no.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, let's try again.
No, people aren't saying.
I think.
This.
Okay, I hear a little bit, but I can ignore it because the question you raised or the argument you raised is quite important. I want to approach it from a methodological angle, namely, really, what does something mean theoretically? What consequences can we do from something? And if we look at the history of science, we see that many scientific theories we either have come to accept, then rejected, come to accept the next ones. The rejected theories were seldom ever rejected fully, but they just lost their traction in an active experimental system. They didn't generate the right questions or new questions or the participation in further endeavors. Again, Hazok Chang would say, like, if we look at phlogiston, there were neither good empirical nor social grounds that led to the rejection of phlogiston. It's rather the taking over of oxygen by Lavoisier was kind of the more active research program. So it's not as clear cut that failure in science is not because we have a really, really substantial ground for dismissals. And that's why I think many theories come back and forth and back and forth. We've got this historical iteration. Same with neuroscience. It's not that you can have or actually really think you can have a logical entailment of a theory in empirical observations. That's just not how empirical science works. What I don't think this means is that this is kind of the Feyerabend and anything goes. I think this would be a step too far, but rather to see a mix between what possibilities do our current empirical observations allow for? What are the historical artifacts by which we study and interpret these observations? And when it comes to mind, this is precisely where Pat Churchland's neurophilosophy comes in. We have a lot of historical artifacts by which we interpret the mind. So to what extent do we really need to think about revising these artifacts? So in that context, I don't think logical entailment is the right criterion, but more to think about what are the current physical possibilities. Also, there might be logical possibilities, and the physical possibilities might change at some point. I mean, that's the fun part of science. But I think in order to negotiate between otherwise highly incompatible theories, where some people say this goes beyond what we can currently know, you can of course logically argue maybe in 100 years we will realize that and that. The question is what would be the positive benefit? How could we get there? So I'm more future oriented. What would be the question that even if we currently would say this is physically impossible, what would be the productive research question by which we could go somewhere beyond our current understanding? So this is, I think, the best way to approach different views of consciousness. And while logical entailment is for me not the best way to go, that's kind of very conceptual analysis and Leibniz. Love Leibniz, but this is like too much of a fixed system. And I think if we rethink what science is away from interpretation of data towards a changing cognitive understanding of framing cosmological questions, it's a much more open-ended pathway. And at least that's how I understand science. I know this is not always how it's taught, with like we've got a hypothesis, we test it, and then but just because there are some bad examples doesn't mean that this is how we should understand it. This is where I'm mainly trained by Stuart Firestein, who wrote the book Ignorance and Failure. So we're kind of joking the third book will be Stagnation. He doesn't find it as funny as I do. But ignorance is a provocative term to say we look at science through the things we do not know, which are defined, of course, by the things we currently know, because like the Rumsfeld theory, we've got known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, and so on. So there's, of course, kind of you must imagine you've got scientific knowledge like a sphere. Rather than going towards the asymptotic theory of truth, towards the truth, this is where we will be, more like you've got scientific knowledge as a sphere, and it's surrounded by the circumference of ignorance. Now, the more knowledge you acquire, and it's kind of like an archaeology of knowledge in Foucault's sense, the more ignorance, like the circumference also grows. So it's not about not knowing things, but developing a sophisticated understanding of not knowing things and where to go from here. So I've got a different picture of science. I think this is where a lot of the disagreements with can come from, because you're sometimes having a different framework from which you're evaluating things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe I'll have one more go at this, and then Anne can have the last word. So yeah, I mean, I actually agree with a lot of that. I don't. Yeah,
it's frustrating when that happens, right? I mean, this
is Keith's trick. He always says, "Oh, we all." Every guest he says, "Yeah, we totally agree." We had a guest on who were defending libertarian free will, Helen Stewart, and I thought we're definitely going to get someone who disagrees with Keith, but it ends up like, "Oh no, we really totally agree." Anyway, let me. So I agree. I don't think science is all about trying to, get a logical entailment from the fundamental facts. Actually, I disagree with this a lot on David Chalmers, who does think everything has to be in some sense logically entailed from the fundamental facts. So why am I talking about logical entailment? I mean, so two things. So one, I suppose for me, what's fundamentally distinctive about consciousness is it's not a public, in my view, it's not a publicly observable datum. You can't look inside someone's head and see their feelings and experiences. So that's what I mean, where it's not logically entailed by it's not a behavioral or functional notion. And that's what the logical entailment point is trying to make, that it's not, it's something we know about in a very different way. We know about it from our immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences. So of course, science deals with unobservables all the time, but I think there's something different in this case. In all other cases, we postulate unobservables in order to explain what we can observe. That in all other cases, that's the task of science, to account for the data of public observation experiments. I want to say in this unique case, there's something else we know about in a different way. We don't know about from looking down a microscope or in a particle collider. It's something we know about in a very different way. And so the explanatory task is not just about accounting for public observation experiment. It's about bringing together what we know through observation experiment with what we know in this very different way, just through our immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences. But I just one more thing just quickly. So you're talking about, scientific methodology. I guess my view is this is not a purely scientific question. It's partly a scientific question, but it's not and that's an open philosophical question. So Sam Harris, for example, thinks ethics should be replaced by science. We can answer all our scientific questions, all our ethical questions through science. And I think most people think that's a bit extreme. We need to do some reasoning to work out whether, abortion is permissible or whatever. But I think something in the case of consciousness, I don't think it is a purely scientific question. There's a scientific question. So in my view, there's a scientific question about which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of experience. But then it's a philosophical question, in my view. What explains that? What's going on in reality to account for the fact that brain activity goes along with conscious experience? And you can give a dualist account of that. You can give a materialist account. You can give a panpsychist account. Because consciousness is not publicly observable, I don't think that is itself a scientific question. So I might agree with, I don't necessarily disagree with you on your conception of science. I just think because consciousness is not publicly observable, dealing with consciousness fully is not a purely scientific question. Anyway, you can have the last word.
Dangerous, because so you raised three things, and let's start with the part where we actually agree, in the sense that there are it's not only a scientific question, it's also is a philosophical one. But I think that's actually the case not just for consciousness, but all scientific endeavor. I think every question in science is also a philosophical one. It has been traditionally, and I think there's a need to slingshot what we used to call natural philosophy into the 21st century. And that's why I am so keen on Pat and Paul Churchland's framework, because for me there was a way of doing this kind of natural philosophy again. When it comes to ethics and science, this is again where so like we need to understand these kind of topics through an iterative scheme. This is where I'm more of a philosopher of science than a philosopher of mind, because a lot of the aspects, even just when we think about ethics, social structures, they are clearly topics that require historical, a sociological, an anthropological, a philosophical perspective in integration and in combination with scientific explanations, because there are some interesting studies on social behavior, whether it's like the in mice TM studies, but they do tell us also something about what we think we can directly observe in ourselves, which we can't. And this brings me to the third point of observation, public observation. This is where I have a little bit of a different view. I mean, the traditional philosopher of science, or also I think Paul Churchland would say, well, it depends what you mean by observation. A lot of things in science are not so publicly observable. If we look at the Large Hadron Collider and these kind of things, they're actually inferences. They're not direct observations. You don't observe these particles. You calculate them as kind of a model of appearances, and with many neural processes too. So if we think, for instance, of fMRI, you don't observe neural activity. You look at actually blood flow and basically different oxygen level of blood flows from which you make inferences about neural activity. Doesn't tell you something necessarily about direction and integration, all these things. So observation is a very, very dangerous term here. That would be the kind of Van Fraassen versus Churchland debate going back and forth, like depends what you mean by observation. And for Paul Churchland, the key thing is that scientific observation is trained observation. It's a skill. And like him, I think the same applies also to our own observation, including, in my case at least, and I'm pretty sure that Paul Churchland would agree, given that kind of overlap, that this applies to sensory perception and consciousness. It is actually a acquired trained skill. This is where I have to highlight as the last word Helmholtz, because he did a lot of these ideas. He wrote a lot about these ideas way before we got all these kind of fancy tools, where he said, well, we have a lot of unconscious inferences. So what do we mean by even just the observation of that we have experience, that we have our own experience? I mean, the amount of times I'm actually kind of autopiloting and I don't really have a conscious experience I'm that aware of. It's kind of interesting and a bit frightening. Well, it's like, what did I actually do today? So I think the question of observation, public observation, should lead us to, rather than saying, oh, we have access to it or not, we sometimes have, we sometimes not. When it comes to public observation, I think where we really, really differ, and why I didn't put these things in the book, but rather I want to think more about that, is we often model the mind independently of the minds of others. And this is where the other minds problem comes from. I don't share that fundamental assumption. So if a friend and a colleague of mine, and I want to highlight her work, Linda Caporel, she said at some point something to me, and her work is based on that, which fundamentally changed my attitude towards cognition and consciousness, namely the mind's natural environment is not things like the coffee cup and stuff, it's other people. And rather than modeling social cognition, emotion on top of cognition, it's the fundament on which we actually can be conscious. So the kind of in some scientists like Graziano, for instance, go in that direction, but they still model the kind of social aspect as on top of. It might be the fundamental part. There are many implications to derive from that. There are many questions of like, what would be the modeling differences? What are the conceptual assumptions, and where would this lead and differentiate from previous alternatives? So we've got the mind versus whatever else is there. That's a work in progress, but at least it's an opportunity which we might want to pursue. And if we think about ourselves in relation to other people, that really, there's this wonderful book which contributed to that. So in addition to Linda's work, there's also Celia Hayes, Cognitive Gadgets, awesome book, where she looks, for instance, to what extent really cultural evolution and the tools we develop are extending our minds, creating new mental mechanisms. And I think this would be a really, really interesting perspective applied to consciousness. Think about Twitter, how it really messes with your qualitative experience of interaction. I mean, this is why I actually left Twitter. It did something to my mind I didn't like. And some people can deal with that. I just couldn't. So for me, it was a way of getting my inner monologue or dialogue, so to speak, like with myself. That sounds weird, but you know what I mean, back. Like to have actually a form of platonic dialogue in my mind that Twitter seemed to kind of like there was this hum of anxiety which affected me. So I think there's a lot of interesting ways to think about consciousness as a product also. Maybe not always, but also I would go for the fundamental aspect, but that's debatable in relation to other minds.
I think that's really exciting. It's do you know Daniel Dennett's 2017 book From Bacteria to Bach?
It's still on the reading list.
Oh, you must read. It's a theme of that. It's one I very much like, the idea that this self-modeling that our introspective reports draw on, and which our whole conception of this private inner world is built around this kind of modeling is for social purposes. It's the whole point of this is the whole point of our conceptualizing ourselves as having an it derives from a kind of from the need to really to tell other people how the world is affecting us. Experiences are experience descriptions are descriptions of the significance of stuff for us, and so. I don't need to tell myself it's bitter. I've just experienced it as being bitter. And so, but describing, conceptualizing it as an experience of something bitter, that's something I can share. Or indeed, as Dennett points out, withhold, because in some cases I don't want to tell people how certain things impact on me. I want to keep it a secret and monopolize it for myself. And then, of course, I can then use that strategically. If I know that this thing impacts on me in a particularly desirable way, I can be strategic about it and keep it for myself, and I can seek it out. So, but the whole point is we don't this world of experience, we don't need to conceptualize it for our own purposes. We sort of it's already doing it. The experience is doing its stuff, directing our behavior. It's to engage with others in collaborative projects, or indeed strategic projects that involve some kind of competition. I think this. I won't go on about this because but I think it's the root of it.
I would agree. I mean, there's so many interesting questions that come from that, and that would again challenge some of our historical understanding in some ways. The questions always, of course, when it comes to historical arguments, the history of whom and what, because one of the most fascinating things is if you just look a bit further, you do find different conceptualizations of these cognitive processes. And one of my most favorite essays written by a graduate student in one of my classes. She was born in Kazakhstan, so she's a native Kazakh speaker, and with many of the mind and brain and dualism debates. So there was the semester where I did the full-on Churchland for an entire semester, different perspectives. It was so much fun. And she wrote an essay in the sense of, well, bewilderment and puzzlement about the terminology, which is very dominant and prevalent in the mind-brain-body dualism debate, is these terms didn't translate sometimes at all into Kazakh.
Right.
And that got me to think more and more also, well, given that Kazakhs originally were especially kind of a more nomadic culture, and lots of these mind-body and mind-brain dualisms are built on a language and culture that is habitually stable. Like you've got I mean, the cities kind of almost look alike by now. And you know where everything is the next day, and you orient yourself in stable landmarks versus if you're really moving around somewhere in the tundra or desert, and if you have a different form of signposting. How does that affect the concepts of mind and the mechanisms of mind you derive from that? I mean, we know that the brain is incredibly plastic, that it's influenced by individual development and social development. We should model it from that way around rather. And I think there's so much to explore these days that just boggles the mind. I mean, quite literally.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I must say, I really encourage anyone who's even remotely interested in the debate to read your book, because it's what it gives more than anything, I think, is a sense of the excitement of the point that we're at at the moment. For a long time, we didn't. I say we as a sort of human scientific community didn't have the tools to really start looking at these things in a way that would. I mean, we do things like single cell recording, and they had lesion studies, and we had some sort of general idea of how neurons worked and what the large areas of the brain did. But none of this really connected up with our sense of what it was like to have a mind. But now we're starting to get, I mean, you described this wonderful new imaging tool, Scape, isn't it? Where we're starting to understand the dynamics of the thing and how things connect up, and how we're starting to get the sense of the function emerging from these individual cells that we'd mapped before. And so it's starting to connect up with our sense of what it's like to be a living creature, and our sense of what it's like to smell and to taste and to see and so on. And this is so exciting to be at the point where we're beginning to see the whole picture, the integrated picture.
I'll second that. Do you have some time for 5 or 10 minutes of questions, Anne, before also people might not know Anne does a very good impression of Kant. I don't know whether before or maybe that's a bit too much of it, but I don't know whether you fancy share it, but anyway, you can.
It's actually I put it on YouTube.
Oh really? Oh well, people can check it out. Maybe we can link to it in. Okay, question here. The olfactory field by question by Seversky. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The olfactory field is not topographically structured like the visual, okay, but isn't a more rudimentary spatiality to smell? Anne's very excited by this question. People on the audio listening on the audio podcast. So isn't there a more rudimentary spatiality to smell, like general direction, instinctive judging, distance by intensity? What do you think about that?
It's a paper I'm currently writing about. So it's okay. Let me start from the beginning. Two things. So one thing is that we can use smell for navigation. Yes. So we find our way around. We use it by concentration. And there's a study by Noam Sobel and a couple of others who some years ago in Berkeley had 32 hungry undergraduates trail some chocolates. They were sensory deprived except for smell, and they did it just like the dogs, not just the behavior in terms of this honing in and out, this kind of zigzagging, but also they got better with training. So we can use smell for spatial navigation. There are many studies that show that. That is a different kind of topography, I mean, because you're not representing the spatiality of the environment in the brain in that case. With vision, you're really representing spatial features of the environment. In this kind, it's a different form of spatial behavior and spatial representation being meant here. That being said, now comes the exciting part again, where I said, like, this is an ongoing field. The paper I'm currently writing about is looking at the current scientific studies that came out in 2020, 2021. So there are two studies in particular that look at, okay, there are two questions involved in that. The first one is, how does the brain represent space with smells, for instance, or can we connect them? And the other one, can we extract spatial information from olfactory information? These are two separate questions. The answer is yes to both. So one study by Jay Gottfried in, I think it was 2020, end of 2020, one of those things that came out just after the book, was to train humans. So you had humans trained on binary mixtures in different concentrations. So you had some, which I'd say was pine and apple, I think. And let's say 20% pine, 40% apple, or 20% pine and 6% apple. And he trained them on a spatial grid in which these concentrations were arranged. So people were trained by really focusing on where they would be according to which kind of concentration ratio. And then he did an experiment where he gave them a primer, like a priming odor, a primer. It's like, okay, let's say 20% this, 60% that. And then it's like, now imagine the next smell I give you will be that concentration. Where in the spatial grid are you? And so they located themselves cognitively on that, and he gave them a second smell. Some of that was correct. Some of that was a like a fake, a kind of distracting smell, and seeing whether this was correct. It turns out that people can be trained to extract some form of cognitive spatial representation. It's not spatial, but it's cognitively spatial map from olfactory information, for instance, through concentration ratios. Yes. The second thing is that there was a study by Cindy Poo in end of 2021 where she trained rats, 6 rats, three she did with I can't even talk anymore. Anyway, she got the heads plugged in, to use a very scientific term, microelectrodes. Now I've got it. Okay. And so 6 behaviors, 3 where they had the recordings, and she's got a platform, elevated platform with north, south, west, and east. Each was trained to have a particular smell, and the port basically was giving them a smell, and they had to orient towards. So yes, okay, this is as such not exciting. You can Pavlov train a rat or mouse to a rodent to find a place, locating it, because I told them like this would be north, this would be south. This is just conditioning. What was interesting is the piriform cortex again, because what they showed is that some percentage of neurons responded only to the identity of the odor, others only to the spatial location, and a certain group to both. Meaning that you can have spatial, or you can have a neural representation of spatial features in the olfactory cortex, nicely dissolving this modularity issue, like showing further to what extent we need to rethink modularity. So these are 2 questions. Now the third thing, because I just mentioned these 2, these are the scientific studies so far. A critical philosopher will of course object, and this is what I'm going to say in that paper. I'm currently really working on it. So hopefully half of it is written, is these are trained cognitive maps. This is a Cartesian system of space. This is not how we use smell behaviorally. And if you, like me, have a dog, there's one thing my dog is really good at, and it started to, in the beginning it annoyed me, and then I thought, that's actually interesting. You know, you walk somewhere and then she rips back your arm because there's a smell you just walked by. And you're like, dog, we just walked past that smell. Couldn't you smell it the first time? Why do we have to go back now? It really annoyed me for a while. And then I thought, no. She's smelling it only now because the airflow just came. So what we need to look at is much more in terms of how we use smell in navigation, which is less Cartesian space and more kind of an embodied space of current airflow. And that connects with not the kind of navigation of Cartesian systems and how we do maps today, but more like Polynesian wayfinding. So there's Ed Hutchins, who did a lot on distributed cognition, who did some Polynesian wayfinding. This is precisely how they navigate in waves, where you don't see stable things. So where you have waves and you've got the embodied experience being on the waves and you see the vortices, that's how spatial navigation works. So coming back to the original question, I'm working on a really conceptually analytic answer to that, combining philosophy with science. But topography is not the same as spatial navigation. I mean, neural topography is spatial navigation. So no to the first, yes to the latter.
Fantastic. That's absolutely fascinating.
I love that question.
Okay, Matthias Johansson asks, any thoughts on a potentially existing interconnected microtubule network across the astrocyte synctium, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, as a physical bridge between and interpreter of neuronal activity as consciousness? I guess this is some reference to the Penrose Hamarov view of consciousness as residing in microtubules. You have any thoughts on this stuff?
Actually, right now, no. I mean, that's a very short answer. To be fair, I do think that that astrocytes play a much more interesting role in theories of mind and brain, but I am currently not really in the position or actually willing to give a broader theoretical interpretation of that. So it's not something
not something you've focused on, or
so far not, and I also don't think that right now it would be. I think it's an interesting speculation, and it would be an interesting way to generate questions, but I don't have an opinion on that.
I mean, one thing I say about this is Penrose.
It's a good question. It's a good question.
Yeah. Penrose's original argument is not really, it's all this stuff about Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And it's not really to do with consciousness. It's more a challenge about cognition. He's interested in how we can have mathematical thought. Can mathematical thought be computational given Gödel's incompleteness theorem? And that leads him in certain directions. But anyway, it's just interesting. And then Hamarov came in and tried to help him out with, with some neuroscience. But it's actually the starting point is more to do with mathematical cognition than consciousness. But anyway, that's just a little thing there.
I would have to speculate, and maybe another time. Let me think about that.
Right, cool. Neuro Crackpot. Oh no, where's Neuro Crackpot's question gone?
I can see it.
No. That's his response to someone else. Oh, here we go. What? Okay, I think we'll have to make this the final question, perhaps. While I understand the point of objectivity with respect to causal mapping, but how much or little can you validly disentangle base sensory perception from the subjective perceptual interpretation / meaning making?
Ooh, good question. I think that comes back to the question of how we frame objectivity and subjectivity, and we still have this dualism. Well, I think there's not the question of can we disentangle it in a categorical sense, but what is the perceptual and experiential phenomenon we're trying to explain? And in that context, you will have inevitably some subjective and some objective features that you link to certain kinds of explanations. And let's say the experience of a smell, to give an example I'm more comfortable with, there will be certain objective causal explanations that explain my variation from others' experiences, and there will also be subjective aspects to it, such as, for instance, my personal history, and certain kind of, in that moment, also perspectival influences. The question is like, what part of that experience are you trying to explain? And in that context, some objective or some reference to objective and causal features might be more relevant, or if you try to explain something different or in a different context than the subjective part. So you can't disentangle the phenomenon, but you can sometimes make a conceptual separation in the explanation. And of course, I mean, I see the twist of the question. Sometimes you might not want to be too categorical with that, because the seeming subjectivity might give more explanation of the causal basis and vice versa.
Thank you very much. Oh, thanks, Anne. That's been a really stimulating discussion, and
well, thank you for the questions. And also, I want to tell I forgot the name, unfortunately, but the Astrocyte person. This is an interesting question. Let me think about that. But I don't want to just bullshit right now. My brain just went blank.
I think that's absolutely fine.
We've been talking for what, well over 2 hours.
We can't manage to keep these things short, can we? There's too much interesting stuff to talk about. We were going to try and do an hour and 90 minutes.
That's too interesting. That's the problem.
Yeah, I wanted to, there's loads of aside from all the other good features of Anne's book, there's so many cool little facts and surprising things, and I wanted to bring in
I had to perhaps, as a fun fact to end, since there were a couple of squirrel and fart comments.
Oh yeah, go.
I had to censor. I actively had to censor, or I was asked to censor 2 of my so I interviewed several scientists, and 2 I had to censor because they said fucking too often, and otherwise the book would have a PG-13 rating. So yeah,
I think that's the first F word we've had on Mind Chat.
Oh my goodness. This happened, unfortunately, in one conference where we were on Zoom. I'm very sorry, but I have to tell that story.
I think you're all right. I don't think
it was kind of funny because I thought I was muted. So the PowerPoint presentation wasn't working, and the clock was running. I was like, oh, for fuck's sake. And then I just got a point in the chat by Alan Love going like, and we broke the F barrier.
The thing is, as soon as we go off air, Keith is effing and jeffing, swearing blind. It'd shock anybody, but he adopts this polite manner on.
There's only so long I can maintain it. You know, it's such. You know, I can only do this public persona for so long.
You could fart it out. Let the sulfur. Let it rip. It's freeing.
We should come back on Twitter though, and
I'm only managing the HBS Bloomington account, but that's it. Not personal. I'm actually quite happy. I'm not doing that anymore.
That's you, is it?
That is me. Yes, that is. It's mainly retweeting interesting things from science, philosophy of science, history of science, related fields, but keeping the personal stuff away.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Twitter does take up too much time, and the thing that annoys me most about Twitter is that Keith always has at least 3,000 followers more than me, and I don't. I keep saying he doesn't even believe in consciousness. He thinks you're all zombies and you're following him. I've caught up with you a bit actually. It was 5,000 at one point. I think it's 3,500 now. I have managed to narrow the gap. If we carry on for like 3 years, I think I'll overtake you. But
it might not. Have you seen the movie 2012? Really good, bad movie. But you see, when John Cusack walks, the lava goes. Then he runs, the lava goes faster. Then he's in a car, the lava goes faster. Then he's in a plane, and the lava goes faster. So maybe it's the same with you and the followers.
Oh, right, yeah. Oh, well, it's thanks so much, Anne. It's been really, really great chatting, and really enjoyed your book. And
thank you very much for having me in the fun conversation.
We must do it again when your next book is out.
There is spoiler alert. We haven't even talked about the cyborg sensors exactly.
Oh wow. Oh, that's a what's the word I'm looking for? Taster. Gone. Teaser. Teaser. That's the word I was looking for.
Keith is the editor of the Element series, of part of the Element series at Cambridge University Press, and he asked me, kindly invited me to write a book about sensory modalities. So that's what I'm currently working on, and I think the deadline is like 31st of August. Yes, I'm working on it.
And that's going to do. It was a question actually. I was going to ask you, we didn't get around to, which is about taking some of the lessons from the study of olfaction and extending them to the other senses, and so that's what I wanted Anne to do. I'm so excited about it. I really can't. It's August.
It's end of August. Yes, it will be. It will be like this summer. Is writing papers, writing. The good thing is it's a small book. He just.
Keith disappeared.
No.
Oh, oh gosh. Oh, you. If Keith doesn't come on, you'll have to do our catchphrase at the end, because I won't have Keith to do it. Is he going to reappear? Oh, here he is again.
Maybe there was an interruption. Okay, you're back.
I think I must have accidentally. The browser suddenly closed. I must have accidentally pressed it. No, I'm looking forward to that very much. So, and I'm sure that will be a very influential little book. So.
Well, I'll work on it. I hope it will be entertaining. But I got so down a rabbit hole in a good sense with just looking at cyborg sensors. People are interested. Brian Keeley does really cool stuff. Some of it is not published yet, so I'm kind of pushing him to publish it. But there's some mind-blowing stuff. Yeah.
Wow, that sounds great. We'll have to get you back on.
We will. We absolutely. We will do that. We can do that.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Anne. Have a lovely day.
Have a lovely day, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again. Wow, that was fun.
It was, wasn't it? I enjoyed that. I really did.
Cool. I'm just exhausted now. How can we make these shorter? This is.
It's quite tiring talking for a long time, but it was fascinating.
I haven't even checked my emails today. We were going to have another chat about the sentient algorithm, but I think I haven't even checked my emails today, so I should probably. I'm in this grant application, and I have my drive. I'm learning to drive. I'm a driving lesson, and so I'm gonna have to just at some point, probably some urgent email from 8 o'clock this morning saying this must be dealt with. But that was absolutely. I think on the hard problem there, I think I was trying out something new, thinking about that stuff about other minds and logical entailment, but I think for the reasons Anne said, actually, I think that's not a good way to press the problem, because I don't ultimately think it's all about logical entailment. So, but anyway, it's good to sort of try out new arguments and stuff and think, yeah, no, that's not a good way to put the point. So, yeah.
Well, we're back again soon, aren't we? We're back again at the end of the month.
Yes. Oh, yes. We didn't talk about we normally say at the beginning. Yeah, final finale of the series, Angela Mendelevici, which was going to be earlier, but we sort of swapped them around. More on how consciousness connects us to the reality around us. The polar opposite position from David Papineau we had earlier. So yeah, so do subscribe, comment, subscribe to the podcast, like the video, help us get this crucial, important content out to the world so it can be changed for the better or something.
Indeed.
Anyway, well, I think we're all exhausted. It's a lovely day. We should probably have a beer in the sun. Is it lovely where you? It's always lovely where you are.
It's warm, and yes,
for once it's lovely. I'm sitting in this dark room with the curtains closed. But yeah, no, there was actually some points even of agreements with me today, and and Keith, we don't disagree so much. I think it always just comes back to me. I think no matter everything we disagree on, at the end of the day, we both agree that consciousness is wherever it is.
Can I do my Shakespeare now before we go?
You're ruining it again. Why? I think you're an anarchist. You're incapable
nowhere else.
Of sticking to rules.
And nowhere else.
You've ruined it now.